So before in previous lectures we talked about how the operation of free and competitive markets are an efficient way of allocating resources between alternative uses so that opportunity cost is minimized and that our living standards, material and non-material, are maximized. So we talked about how in the lecture on price signals and relative prices, how relative prices act as price signals to producers of what consumers want, and so that producers can allocate resources accordingly so that needs and wants are maximized in the economy. So before we start this lecture on market failure, we're going to look at the definition of what this means. So what market failure is that in some cases the operation of the free market does not lead to an efficient allocation of resources. And by this I mean opportunity cost is not minimized. So that's across there. And also the concept that our needs and wants are not maximized. And so all this is in relation to the free and competitive market. So before we start looking at different types of market failure which do not lead to an efficient allocation of resources, we're going to look at the preconditions that a perfectly competitive market must meet. Perfectly competitive market. So let's look at the preconditions that must be met for this market to exist. So firstly, there is strong competition between buyers and sellers. Buyers and sellers. Secondly, there is consumer sovereignty. And so this means that producers only produce what the consumers want. So producers allocate resources according to the demand for certain goods and services. There is also perfect knowledge or complete information by buyers and sellers. So we also assume that there is a rational consumer. So this consumer isn't affected by advertising and all those certain things that make us irrational. And this is one of the market failures we'll talk about later. The fourth condition is that there is an ease of entry and exit. So by this I mean resources can be easily allocated to competing alternatives. So if say the market for pizza becomes profitable, hamburger sellers or fish and chip shop owners can easily mobilize their resources to the production of pizza. And also there's a very easy way to exit the market. And so if fish and chip shop owners believe that there is greater opportunities that exist in the pizza shop, then they can easily exit the market for fish and chips. So they don't need to worry about like rent costs or other resource costs associated with changing productive uses. And also there's a desire. The final precondition is the desire for businesses or producers to maximize profits. And this also helps the allocation of resources to their most productive use, which also correlates to where resources can obtain the most profits. Okay, so now we can see that the perfectly competitive market is an amalgamation of all these different conditions. So let's talk about the different types of market failure that may exist. So the market failure is when the operation of the free market does not lead to an efficient allocation of resources. That's actually a pretty dodgy lead. So let's rewrite that. lead. That is meant to be lead. L-E-A-D. Okay. So in this lecture, we're just going to have an introductory sort of example on what different types of market value is, and there will be lectures leading on to this where we go into depth of many of these market values that occur. Okay, so let's look at these different types of market values one by one. This is very minor. I stress that this is very brief, and if you want further and more complete understanding of these different types of market values, look into further lectures on Talkboard. Okay, so firstly we have when firms have market power. Let's make this more clear and emphasize that these are types of market failure. Okay, so when firms have more power, have market power, and this relates to this part here. So there isn't strong competition between buyers and sellers because some firms have market power, and this relates to, say, the concept of a monopoly or an oligopoly. Secondly, we have the concept that there may be asymmetric information. So this is when one party enters the transaction knowing more about the certain good or service than the other. So this relates back to an agency problem. So for example, say you go into a car dealership and the dealer knows the car is pretty dodgy, but they're going to sell it to you as being a perfectly good car. And so there is no perfect knowledge in this example. So let's cross here, and there is no perfect knowledge. So the consumer does not know how or what product to buy so that they maximize their living standards because the producer or the seller is telling them the wrong thing. Okay. The third example is when you have externality that occur. And externalities are sort of extra costs or benefits for third parties that may arise when goods or services are produced or consumed. And so what this means is that because in a transaction we assume that the material living standards or the living standards will change only the two entering the transaction, certain consumption or production of goods or services may affect a third party that isn't involved in the transaction. So let's say, for example, secondhand smoke. Although buying a packet of cigarettes may mean that the living standards of that person who is smoking may increase for whatever reason, it would also affect a third party. So if you're smoking in a cafe, people who don't enjoy smoking would have their living standards decrease because of secondhand smoke, for example. And that's an example of an externality. So externalities can be positive or negative. I will go through both positive and negative in the lecture on externalities. Thirdly, we have when the market does not produce sufficient desirable goods. So here there is sufficient desirable goods are underproduced. This relates back to a similar concept that there is an overproduction of undesirable goods. And so the desirable goods may be, say, immunization, medicine, which become underproduced because they are not profitable, because research and development is not recognized as a profit, and so businesses, especially biotech firms, don't seek to produce these medicine or medical advances because they prove unprofitable in the general market structure. And also there's an overproduction of undesirable goods such as drugs because they prove so profitable in the market. And finally we have public goods, and this is a very similar concept to the underproduction of desirable goods because they are public goods. As, and what public goods are is that you cannot exclude the consumption of these goods. So say, for example, street lamps. Although it is necessary for the benefit of the entire community that we have street lamps, so that we're not walking blind at night. No one's going to produce them because there is no way of actually charging who pays or allowing those who pay to use them, because you can't exclude people using or seeing light. And so that's an example of a public good. And we'll go through this concept into more depth in further lectures on public goods. But to recap, market failure is where the operation of the free market does not lead to an efficient allocation of resources in the form that opportunity cost is not minimized and needs and wants are not maximized. And needs and wants relate back to the idea of living standards. So living standards are not maximized in the community's eyes. So the type of market failures relate to where firms have market power, so there is not a strong competition between buyers and sellers. There's asymmetric information, so this relates back to the agency problem, where there is not a perfect knowledge exhibited by the consumer or the producer. Also, externalities, which may be positive or negative, create market failure. And also, finally, the underproduction of desirable goods and services, and also the overproduction of undesirable goods and services.